Hello, and welcome to Autocracy Now! This week it's episode 13, the last in our series on Stalin. It's called Fall of the Tsar, Death and Legacy. In 1951, Stalin was 73 and in declining health. His physical and mental faculties were starting to decline, but his keen sense of paranoia did not. When a secret policeman, deputy head of the MGB, called Ryumin, sent him a letter, detailing a wild conspiracy theory that Jewish doctors had been responsible for the murder of lead Soviet officials, it was music to Stalin's ears. Here was a new chance to combine his growing anti-Semitism, his mistrust of doctors, and his fears over his own ailing health into a new purge project. It was time, thought Stalin, for another purge. Ryumin's letter was encouraged by some members of the Politburo, like Malenkov. In unleashing another wave of political violence, though, they were playing with fire. There is evidence that Stalin felt that this, the doctor's plot, was a good excuse to turn on all of his old associates. The plot started with doctors, but there was no way that Stalin wanted it to end there. Rather than a specific conspiracy among doctors to assassinate Bolshevik leaders, he wanted to expand the inquiry, to unearth a vast conspiracy, a US-backed spy network linked to the Zionists of Israel that had nothing in mind other than the complete destruction of the Soviet state. His attitude towards his Politburo members while he was engineering the doctor's plot was a mix of suspicion and pity. He said, quote, "You are blind like young kittens. What will happen without me? The country will perish because you do not know how to recognize enemies." His behaviour became increasingly ominous, constantly grumbling, forgetting the names of his closest comrades, and muttering about how the Politburo was too old. "We must be replaced by younger bodies," he said at one point. His behaviour was enough to cause considerable alarm amongst his inner circle. In a bizarre episode, he lashed out at his bodyguard and threatened to put him on trial for a conspiracy, and sacked the Soviet Minister for Trade. This imagined conspiracy was about some unripe bananas that he'd been served a few days ago. The Minister for Trade must have been baffled by his sudden dismissal. It was only the quiet dismissal and the lack of action on the part of the Politburo that stopped the banana plot from escalating. But any sign of instability in Stalin could have been exploited by these men to fight their own political battles. The same bodyguard who had served Stalin for decades was sacked for, bizarrely, encouraging his son Vasily's alcoholism. He persecuted Beria's friends and was probably planning his eventual political destruction, biding his time until he could implicate Beria. For his part, Beria was getting more and more ambitious, and more impatient for Stalin himself to die. He had plans for reform of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, and even considered that private property should be restored. As well as a sick, sadistic, torturing rapist with skeletons in his basement, he was an intellectual with a coherent political plan for the party, and his contempt for Stalin was increasing by the day. His son wrote that he viewed Stalin as less than human. It was not long before ridiculous allegations were going around that Beria was secretly Jewish. His enemies in the Politburo and in the Soviet system were attempting to manipulate Stalin into one last flailing attack against his closest political associates. He had his doctors and other prominent Jewish people arrested and ordered his new favourite secret policeman to torture them. Beat, beat, and beat again. Put them in chains, grind them into powder. This was his preferred tactic for the investigations. The anti-Semitism, which was still officially denounced, was increasing. Stalin insisted that Russian writers should have their Semitic names published in brackets next to their Russian pseudonyms. Does this sound familiar? There are allegations, although not much concrete evidence, that Stalin was planning a massive purge of Jews from the USSR. There was a letter that the magnates around Stalin said was going to order compulsory eviction of the Jews. Ominously, it was recently discovered that 2 new gulags were being built in the early 1950s. You wouldn't put it past him, would you? The more vulnerable Stalin feels, the more he lashed out. It had always been this way, and his declining health was the final vulnerability of his life. And this is the pain and the suffering that an autocrat can cause, when tiny things like a banana that's unripe being served to you can lead to massive consequences for the state. Because when the state reflects a person so completely, when that person becomes unstable, what does it mean for the state? At the party congress towards the end of 1952, He rounded on Molotov and Mikoyan, long-standing old Bolsheviks who'd been Politburo members for decades. He denounced them, implying that they were involved in Zionist plotting, and casting aspersions on Molotov for his Jewish wife. They were removed from the new instrument of government that Stalin was setting up, and banned from attending his parties. If Beria and the others felt any satisfaction at the destruction of some more of their rivals, it didn't last long. Stalin was escalating his purge, and they were all convinced that he meant to have them not only removed from power, but arrested, tortured, and killed. After all, they'd spent the last 20 years watching Stalin deal with all his perceived problems this way. They knew that status, loyalty, and friendship would not necessarily protect you. Just look at Kirov. There is some evidence that Beria, Khrushchev, Molotov, and Mikoyan defended each other against the wrath of the aging Stalin. Unlike in previous purges, they all refused to denounce the others. An act of apparent loyalty that probably had more to do with the terror of an irrational, aging Stalin with violent mood swings than any genuine friendship between the men. The rumbling doctor's plot was signified at the start of 1953 with another hysterical article in Pravda. Quote, "Investigation established that participants in the terrorist group, exploiting their positions as doctors and abusing the trust of their patients, deliberately and viciously undermined their patients' health by making incorrect diagnoses and then killed them with bad and incorrect treatments. Covering themselves with the noble and merciful calling of physicians, men of science, these fiends and killers dishonoured the holy banner of science. Having taken the path of monstrous crimes, they defiled the honour of scientists. Among the victims of this band of inhuman beasts were comrades Zdanov and Sherbakov. The majority of participants of the terrorist group were bought by American intelligence. They were recruited by a branch office of American intelligence, the international Jewish bourgeois nationalist organisation called Joint. The filthy face of this Zionist spy organisation, covering up their vicious actions under the mask of charity, is now completely revealed. Other participants were long-time agents of English intelligence, serving it for many years, carrying out its most criminal and sordid tasks. The bigwigs of the USA and their English junior partners know that to achieve domination over other nations by peaceful means is impossible. Feverishly preparing for a new world war, they energetically send spies inside the USSR and the people's democratic countries. They attempt to accomplish what the Hitlerites could not do, to create in the USSR their own subversive fifth column." End quote. This hysteria and this bizarre conspiracy theory had Jewish people in the Soviet Union and Stalin's inner circle terrified. The escalating rhetoric against Jewish people, the elevation of conspiracy theories to the top branch of government, and the escalating rhetoric against the USA was a clear provocation. Would they intervene? There were those around Stalin convinced that he was hoping to trigger World War III. Now this strikes me as unlikely, but his motives are often unreadable. The old man was clearly planning something, and he remained utterly and ruthlessly in control of the state apparatus of terror that had kept him in power. The 4 Politburo members even considered assassinating Stalin, but they quickly dismissed the idea. The issue is one of trust. They all knew that after Stalin died there would be a power struggle. If they conspired in his murder, it would become a tool of that power struggle, and they may have all ended up dead. Or, as Mikoyan put it, "We were afraid that the people would not understand." Early one Sunday morning, in March 1953, after a long drinking session with his political associates, who were, by now, his only friends, tipsy and cheerful, Stalin dismissed the Politburo and his bodyguards. Unusually, he ordered them not to call and check on him, but maybe he was just concerned about a brewing hangover. The next day, Stalin was late to appear. The anxious bodyguards waited for hours. His schedule was usually regular, albeit completely nocturnal. A light was switched on in the dacha, and they assumed that he would be emerging soon. But he didn't arrive. Eventually, a package arrived for Stalin, and the guards were forced to make a decision. Risk his wrath for disturbing him, or risk his wrath for failing to deliver his mail? When you're dealing with a man who threatens treason trials over unripe bananas, even the little decisions become paralysed by terror. Eventually, one of them plucked up the courage to see the leader. He was discovered, collapsed on the floor, drenched in his own urine. His watch had stopped when he hit the ground 6 hours before, and he was only able to emit a low, buzzing noise instead of speech. Stalin had had a massive stroke, and had probably fallen over the moment he turned on the light in the dacha. The events that followed, more than anything else, indicate just how much Stalin had impressed himself on the mind of the nation, and on the people who surrounded him. The response was immediate panic, crippling fear. The bodyguards knew that Stalin was not yet dead, and he was orchestrating a plot against killer doctors. If they summoned doctors and Stalin recovered, they could be implicated in the plot and shot. But if they failed to fetch medical attention and Stalin recovered, surely he'd have them killed for sabotaging his health. Just like the days after Barbarossa, a sense of mad panic was in the air. Everyone wanted to shift the responsibility onto someone else. Everyone was scared of Stalin's reaction. This, in microcosm, was the fatal flaw of the Soviet Union under Stalin. He created this atmosphere of terror that meant that reform, meaningful action, was impossible without his say-so, and everyone was hampered by considering how he, personally, would react. The next few days are somewhat murky historically. Everyone had their own motivations in the issue of succession to talk about these next few days. Robert Service describes them as clear as tar. Different individuals, it seems, remember things differently for their own political reasons. What does seem clear is that the bodyguards, hoping to absolve responsibility, summoned the Politburo members. Then there was a vigil for a number of days over Stalin's prone body. Everyone was transfixed by his condition. His underlings, Beria especially, were certainly planning their coups and how they would seize power. Yet none of them could act while Stalin still lived, with the remote possibility that he might recover. He could no longer speak, just like Lenin in his final days, but a word from him, if he could say it, would still mean death. None of them called a doctor for the first 12 hours after the stroke. While they all clearly had an incentive to leave Stalin to die, after all, if he recovered, what happened wasn't going to be pretty, I don't think it amounts to negligent murder. Stalin's own doctor was currently being tortured in secret police dungeons. The decision to call one could easily have backfired, and that, as much as anything, was probably why they didn't do it. At any rate, medically speaking, it probably wouldn't have helped. A brain operation might have saved Stalin's life, but you can hardly imagine anyone feeling they had the authority to let that happen. Also, if I was a doctor, I'd be really reluctant to operate on Stalin. If he died, there would surely be consequences. Beria, who feared for his own life after the persecution of his friends and allies, was key to this delay. He'd later boast, quote, "I did him in! I saved you all!" This was probably not literal, implying that he murdered Stalin, although he did like his poison, but instead a reference to the delayed treatment. There are of course conspiracy theories that Beria drugged Stalin and had him assassinated. With no evidence, it's hard to come to any conclusion either way. I lean towards thinking it was natural causes for a number of reasons. Stalin was old, he was an alcoholic, he was in declining health, and the timeline for Beria drugging Stalin doesn't hang together particularly well. You also have to remember that everyone was in total awe of Stalin. He'd become the godlike figure who dictated everything to them. Their paralysis during his final illness was as much to do with the fact that they'd never done anything without consulting him for decades. They owed their lives to him, they owed their careers to him, and even though he'd declined in recent years, to many of the Politburo, he was still the omnipotent intellectual who had dragged the country through the 5-year plans, the terror, and the war. If you'd lived your life and political career, the last 30 years in constant fear of such a man, seeing him almost every day, knowing that he could order your death at the drop of a hat, seeing the people he'd had killed, being forced to gauge his moods and respond accordingly, would you really put it past him to spring from his apparent deathbed and denounce everyone who was there as enemies and spies? Also, strong evidence against this conspiracy theory is the fact that Beria wasn't in an especially strong position, as shown by what happened after Stalin's death. So if it was an assassination, he didn't think it through. The doctors who were being tortured in the grim cellars of the Lubyanka prison were suddenly being asked a rather different set of questions by their persecutors. Instead of being ordered to implicate themselves in a vast Jewish conspiracy, the doctors were suddenly being asked about a hypothetical patient. If he exhibits Cheyne-Stokes respiration, what does this mean for the prognosis? The confused doctors replied that this would be a most serious symptom indeed. The prognosis was grim for Stalin. Svetlana and the other party bosses were summoned to his deathbed. The drunken Vasily yelled at everyone for failing to save him, probably already afraid of their retribution. Beria, according to sources that are probably quite biased, oscillated between denouncing Stalin's prone body and then returning to kiss his hand and display subservience whenever it looked like Stalin was about to wake up. Doctors were eventually summoned and, with trembling hands, examined the patient. They would later say in memoirs that they too were all convinced that they were going to be killed. For 5 days, this scene dragged out. Svetlana, who loved her father more tenderly than she ever had before, a staggering Vasily, a scheming, denouncing, amped-up Beria, and the others, who had served Stalin for so long and felt such a strange mixture of relief and sadness that they all reported. They were observing the death of a vast titan of history, and a vast titan in their own lives. The significance of the occasion was lost on no one. Many of them openly wept. On the morning of the 5th of March 1953, Stalin breathed his last. Svetlana, his only daughter, described it in her book. At the last minute he opened his eyes. It was a terrible look, either mad or angry, and full of the fear of death. His hand rose, he seemed to be pointing upwards, or threatening us all. Then with one last effort his spirit tore itself from his body. We all stood frozen and silent. Then the hand fell back down. The king was dead. Beria leapt to be the first to kiss that cold dead hand. Then he sped off to shred some incriminating documents in the Kremlin, although he was unable to save his own historical reputation, as you can probably tell by the way I've described him so far. The others lined up to pay their respects to his body. Even those who had been immediately scheduled for liquidation wept at the death of their ruler. He left a huge vacuum in their lives, and at the head of the Soviet superstate and world communism. He also left behind a power struggle and a complex legacy. His body was embalmed and his death was announced to a shocked Soviet state the following day. The people had not been told about his ailing health, and so the death came as a surprise. It was akin to their JFK moment, but arguably more cataclysmic. Everyone remembered where they were when they heard the news. His body was displayed in Red Square in Moscow, alongside Lenin, and the crowds that flocked to see it soon became so large that the event was a human crush disaster. Thousands of people were injured, and it's probable that hundreds died in the crush, although the newspapers and authorities covered up the full extent of the damage, and merely reported obituaries of Stalin. Even from beyond the grave, he was causing death and suffering to the Russian people. I'll talk about the power struggle to succeed Stalin first and tie up the loose ends before trying to assess his legacy. Stalin's official positions, which had been numerous but never really the point of his power, were divided up between the Politburo members. It was Beria who took the initiative on Stalin's death, racing to the Kremlin and taking charge. Immediately he began a whirlwind of reforms. Backed up by Malenkov, he released over 1 million political prisoners from the Gulag, cancelled the purge of the Doctors' Plot, and was beginning to show signs of liberalising the Soviet hold over the satellite nations in the Baltic and in East Germany. It's hard to know what Beria's plans were for the regime. He held Stalin and his policies in contempt, and was clearly itching to shape things in his own way. Maybe he was planning a détente with the West. But he was a brutal killer, and a personally very unpleasant man. The other members of the Politburo doubtless despised him. An attempted uprising in East Germany convinced many who were sitting on the fence that he was a threat to Soviet power and hegemony over the communist states. Khrushchev began approaching other members of the Politburo and, likely as much out of fear for their own skins if Beria turned on them, they all, including Malenkov, agreed to denounce him. Khrushchev also approached Marshal Zhukov in his exile in the Ural Mountains. He agreed to be the muscle behind their coup, probably very keen to avenge himself on Beria, who'd been key in getting him demoted in the first place. In a meeting on the 26th of June, Khrushchev ambushed Beria in a very Stalinist way, accusing him of being a British spy and a traitor to the Soviet Union. Beria, perhaps arrogantly, didn't realise that this meeting was his downfall. When a signal was given, Marshal Zhukov arrived and gleefully arrested Beria. He suffered the fate of so many Soviet politicians before him, the fate that he dished out to so many. In a secret trial, he was accused of treason, terrorism, and counter-revolutionary activities. There is no small amount of poetic justice in the way Beria fell. It was the same way he had destroyed many of his own political rivals. He begged to be allowed to live, but his executioners stuffed a rag into his mouth to shut him up, and he was shot and buried anonymously in a forest, as so many of his victims had been. Although all the members of the Politburo signed death warrants and engaged in a vicious purging of Stalin's foes, and it's unfair to pin everything on Beria, as Stalin apologists often do, he was a personally vile man, and has been rightly reviled by history. Khrushchev emerged as the dominant leader, and for a few years there was semi-stability at the top of the Soviet order. In 1956, though, Khrushchev pivoted, delivering the infamous secret speech on the cult of personality and its consequences. Here, to the shock of everyone, he denounced Stalinist crimes. Quote, "After Stalin's death, the Central Committee began to implement a policy of explaining concisely and consistently that is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism, to elevate one person, to transform him into a superman possessing supernatural characteristics akin to those of a god. Such a man supposedly knows everything, sees everything, thinks for everyone, can do anything, is infallible in his behaviour. Such a belief about a man, and specifically about Stalin, was cultivated amongst us for many years." End quote. He reminded everyone that Marxism had no room for individual dictators, implying that Stalin had betrayed Marxism. Lenin was still held in high regard as a glorious leader, but Khrushchev was set on reshaping history. Lenin's testament, the damning passage that described Stalin as rude and said he should have been replaced, it had been suppressed for more than 30 years, but it was read out by Khrushchev to the gathered communists. He then went on to denounce Stalin's capricious and despotic character. And although he was careful to insist that Trotsky, Bukharin and Stalin's other enemies had been wrong about communism, he denounced their liquidation and Stalin's use of torture to extract confessions from so-called enemies of the people. To considerable indignation, he described the extent of how the terror had affected the Communist Party, how many of the members of the party Congress had voted against Stalin and been shot, and how the security service had fabricated the cases against them, with specific examples. Khrushchev left an awful lot out. For example, the fact that he, and all the other members of the Politburo except for Stalin and Beria, were complicit. He never mentioned that their involvement in the treason trials. He told the delegates how they had been bugged and were fearful that Stalin would have them killed, but their own role in encouraging purges and using them to dispatch of political enemies was conveniently ignored. But it is amazing to think how daring Khrushchev often was in his criticism of Stalin. Quote, "You see what Stalin's mania for greatness led to. He completely lost consciousness of reality. He demonstrated his suspicion and haughtiness not only in relation to the individuals in the USSR, but in relation to whole parties and nations." End quote. You can read the whole speech online if you Google Khrushchev's secret speech, and it's a really fascinating read. You can even see what the reactions were of the people in the room because it's all part of the transcript. We're watching the careful manipulation of history for Khrushchev's own political ends. Selective disclosure of what had gone on during Stalin's treason trials. Acknowledgement of the Great Terror, to an extent. And yet most of what he said has been substantiated as true as the Soviet archives have been opened up. Everyone in the USSR knew that Stalin had repressed and purged people. The evidence had been there in the disappearing party and political figures, and there's no way you could conceal the mass arrests of 1937. But it had rarely been discussed openly, for fear of reprisals until now. The secret speech, which was soon widely published, was a comprehensive denunciation of Stalin and Stalinism, a tumultuous event in Soviet history. Khrushchev had numerous motivations for being the one to denounce Stalin's crimes. A desire to see the truth exposed and to rehabilitate old friends, as well as revenge himself on the legacy of the man he'd lived in fear from for so long. But also there were many political reasons. It bolstered his own legitimacy to expose this last great conspiracy. And he hoped that by removing the fear of repression and political murder from the USSR, the party might be more efficient, and he might be less at risk from political murder. But it was also key to maintaining the structure of the state. Throughout the speech, Khrushchev praises Lenin and Marxism, and reaffirms his commitment and the USSR's commitment to its founding philosophy. He was portraying Stalin as a dangerous deviation from that philosophy, and blaming him for the failures of the state. This allowed the communist regime to be prolonged. De-Stalinization helped in some of Khrushchev's reforms. The gulags were eventually closed, references to Stalin were removed from public buildings, and the national anthem. The Soviet Union was moving forward, or so at least its leadership claimed. It also undermined his rivals in the Politburo. Condemning the terror made it possible for Khrushchev to imply that anyone who opposed him was advocating a return to Stalinism. He owned the denunciation of Stalin, and subtly presented himself as the way forward, rather than a reversion back to the bad old days. His Politburo rivals tried to depose him in 1957, But eventually, Molotov, Malenkov and Kaganovich were sacked after they bitterly disputed over who'd been the most guilty in Stalinist crimes and death lists. But the days of mass political murder in the Soviet Union, Stalin would have purged these rivals. The days of mass political murder in the Soviet Union were done. They retired, they wrote their memoirs, and they died. At the same time, the secret speech created riots and unrest in Hungary and Eastern Europe, who perhaps hoped that this liberalisation would allow these states to be freed. Khrushchev himself was overthrown in 1964 after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also retired, writing his memoirs and dying in 1971. He would also eventually admit to being up to my elbows, quote, in the blood of his victims. After a long break from Russia, I might one day try and deal with his fascinating attempts to reform and preserve the Soviet system. Vasily Stalin was right to be afraid of the Stalinist Politburo. He was arrested shortly after Stalin's death for getting drunk and discussing state secrets with Western diplomats, which, in fairness, doesn't sound all that ridiculous. He was eventually released from prison under de-Stalinisation, but he died in 1961 due to his alcoholism. His is a tragic tale with little to redeem it. Svetlana defected to the West in 1961 and lived a tumultuous but fascinating life. She got married numerous times and wrote books about her experiences. She returned to Russia, left again, and lived in England and the United States under the name Lana Peters for many years. She died in 2011. Her children, Stalin's grandchildren, are still alive and living in the US and Russia. She was never able to escape from the shadow of her father, and this was a constant frustration for her. It could also be said for the nation as a whole. So what of Stalin's legacy? For someone with such immense political power, the man of steel, with a superpower state and a legion of killers at his disposal, and for someone who had ordered the deaths of so many, Stalin's life seems dominated by fear. Hitler might have been driven by hate and a twisted ideology about the future of the world, but you never get the sense that Stalin was in the same way. In a less guarded moment, he confessed to Zhukov, "I'm a most unfortunate person, afraid of my own shadow." It was necessary for him to not only remove his political rivals from power, but later to have them humiliated and killed. In the case of the highly suspicious death of Kirov, suspicions likely led him to eliminate one of his closest friends. While he certainly didn't believe that everyone who was invested in the Great Terror was part of a real, vast Trotskyite conspiracy theory, he was afraid enough for his own position and ruthless enough that he felt it necessary to liquidate thousands of innocent people. Before the war, he was in utter denial about the threat of Nazi invasion. His fear did not serve him well then. When it occurred, he had a nervous breakdown. After the war, in his declining years, his paranoia only increased. At the end of his life, he was an irrational maniac, persecuting his own doctors, obsessed with the idea they were going to kill him. It would be tragic if he didn't also have the power to destroy them. And the amount that he'd intimidated his Politburo probably led to his own death in the sense that he couldn't get the medical care he needed. Even in Stalin's politics, the fear has a firm hold. Anything that was suboptimal, anything that went wrong in his meticulously drafted micromanaged plans, was the inevitable consequence of wreckers and saboteurs. Instead of the state driven by the idealism of communism, instead of being a fanatical communist, he believed in fear, both as a weapon of control and as a motivating factor in his life. If the emotion that dominated Stalin's psyche was monotonic, then his response to any problem was nearly as constant. Here, the gaps and confusions of Marx and the brash authoritarianism of Lenin have their own contributions to make. But Stalin's preferred solution to any problem was a struggle as vast and titanic in scale as the nation he ran, even when this was far from the most efficient way of running things. I always used to compare my own style in answering exam questions to the 5-year plan. Set ridiculous targets for the number of words you produce, and over-fulfill them through ridiculous effort, even if the quality was lacking. It worked too, but maybe because people didn't want to read my handwriting. Economic, industrial, agricultural development, the war effort, the conquest of internal enemies, the cultural and social changes that would lead to socialism, or at least to Stalin remaining in power. All of these disparate and complex problems were attacked with an emphasis on might, brute force, and massive struggle. Stalin was not a total ideologue. He was pragmatic and capable of compromise on numerous occasions, strategically withdrawing from his positions when it suited him, and when it was necessary to remain in power. This explains why he was capable of remaining in charge for so long. But the withdrawals were only ever temporary substitutes for his preferred method of autocracy, a constant, never-ending revolutionary struggle. This was what he had grown up into and what the ideology of Lenin had frozen into, and he maintained it until the end. The frozen, rigid, locked-in nature of the system made reforming it almost impossible. There were areas of ruthless efficiency, industrialisation creating the war machine, but there were also areas where the slavish devotion to the party, and Stalin in particular, rendered everything inefficient. You think of useless steel piling up in warehouses, competent workers and managers arrested or killed. With no opposition, and completely hostile to criticism of its rigid ideology and policies, the Stalinist system was as inflexible a government as the old Tsarist regime that couldn't accept the necessity for democracy and reform. The USSR attained military supremacy with the Red Army, and managed to catch up even with the US in developing nuclear weapons. The threat of force rendered it a superpower. But true socialism was never even close to being established. Stalin would insist in later years on his motto, "Life is getting better, comrades. Life is getting merrier." But so much of the Soviet economic development was concentrated on the military. Collectivization didn't even begin to solve the agricultural problems that plagued the Soviet Union, and it caused mass casualties in the countryside. The quality of life for most people stayed the same or became worse under Stalin as the rest of the world developed. And on this level, the communist states rarely came close to competing with the West. As big a reason as any for the collapse of their support when the Soviet Union fell apart. Economic inequality, social problems, widespread corruption, they were huge problems in the Soviet system. And it was completely incapable of reform. When Gorbachev tried, the whole state collapsed. This is as much to do with the concentration of power as anything else. The USSR had been established as a socialist paradise. Stalin had run it as a tyrannical dictatorship. It ended up being as far from Marx's dream as most regimes. Stalin sowed the seeds of the Sino-Soviet split that would eventually undermine the influence of the USSR. Communist parties in other nations like Yugoslavia were beginning to show signs of disloyalty and chafing under the hegemony of Moscow. Stalin's early policies modernised the nation in a lot of ways. Education was free and widespread, and Russian literacy rates shot up. But it was also shot through with propaganda, and liberal free expression was as tightly controlled as it ever had been in Russia. Censorship of any kind of anti-Stalinist idea repressed the cultural lives of Soviet citizens immensely. There's an old joke that they had two TV channels in the Soviet Union. Channel 1 was propaganda, and Channel 2 was a KGB agent shouting at you to change back to Channel 1. This joke combined so much about the USSR. The subtle, grumbling dissent that was all that was permitted, the ever-present threat of political coercion, the repression of free information, the propaganda, and the lack of development. Stalin is remembered by many as a war hero. The Soviet Union certainly played the leading role in the defeat of Hitler, but they did so out of a desire to defend their homeland rather than the brutally imposed ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Just look at the concessions to patriotism and religious worship that Stalin made to help the war effort. During the Civil War in 1918-19, you can read the diaries of the young men, and they're saying things like, "Communism is the true light. When we've established this perfect society and defeated the White Russians, everything will be better." You don't see so much commitment to the ideology of communism in the 1941 Barbarossa diaries. There it's about defending themselves. And the human cost of Stalin's policies, in wartime and in peacetime, can never be forgotten, because they're one of the most stark indicators of the dangers of autocracy. Orlando Figes, Stalinist historian, put it well when he described the legacy of the revolution that Stalin had betrayed. He said, quote, "We must strengthen our democracy, not only as a source of freedom but of social justice, so that the disadvantaged and the disillusioned do not reject it again." Note that since the collapse of communism, Stalin's popularity amongst Russians has been on the rise, from a low of 27% in 1994 to 45% in 2011. And yes, that is currently, as I write this, more than the approval rating for Donald Trump. Indeed, Stalin was voted the most popular Russian of all time in a recent, albeit controversial poll. Some of this is to do with the influence of Putin, of course. In Russia, there will always be those who will view him as a hero for winning the war and establishing the USSR as a global superpower, in the same way that people lionize the British Empire and ignore the terrible atrocities that it was associated with. There are those who buy into the propaganda that socialism was only foiled by saboteurs and wreckers, and there are those who feel enough affection for the great leader, the time when Russia was great, who was genuinely beloved by many in his lifetime. they're still willing to buy into this idea that the flames of terror were fanned by those around him. Accepting the harsh history of your own country is often difficult. Even outside Russia, there are still many out there in the world today who defend him and argue that reports of his crimes are greatly exaggerated. The current regime in Russia is loath to criticise a national hero, and shares enough of his authoritarian characteristics that to do so would be unwise. His support is still on the rise. Stalin's Western defenders are naive or dishonest. They conflate his reign with the dream of fairness and a socialist paradise. Just as in the Communist Manifesto, the criticism of the West and the status quo is far more convincing, eloquent, and persuasive than the sketchy explanations of the alternative that they propose. True socialism has never been established. Those who want to argue against this point of view are forced into bizarre contortions to defend dictators like Stalin and Mao. It seems clear that Stalin had little interest in establishing socialism, despite his rhetoric, and despite his many speeches and writings on the subject. His principal concern was remaining in power, which he did, ruthlessly and brilliantly, for nearly 30 years. But he was no raving lunatic. Until the very end of his life, he seemed perfectly sane and in control to everyone surrounding him, even though his policies were as often justified by irrational fear as they were by a rational desire to maintain control. He was a complex man, capable of charm and concession, as well as violence and repression. The less one-dimensional portrait we paint of a man like Stalin, the more we allow them detail, nuance, and human characteristics, the better equipped we are to understand autocracy and autocrats. The cobbler's son from Gori, the dropout trainee priest, the bank robber, the mass-murdering dictator. Stalin was all of these, and he left his mark on history. If we are wise, and if we want to learn lessons from the past, we will never stop discussing it. Thanks for listening to Autocracy Now. That was the last in our series on Stalin. Next time we'll be dealing with quite a different figure. You can email us at autocracynow@outlook.com. Follow us on Twitter at autocracynow, and like our page on Facebook. If you want something a little different, you can listen to our sister podcast, Physical Attraction, about physics. Please leave a rating and review on iTunes or your favourite podcatcher. That way I don't have to paint bridges with our logo. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. We'll be back soon. Until then, be kind to each other.